Welcome into Unpaid Interns. I am Griffin Epstein. It is a beautiful Friday afternoon in Bloomington, unseasonably warm out, and the excitement is high in Bloomington because there is a big-time college football game tomorrow. The number 13 Indiana Hoosiers, feels weird to say, but number 13 in the country, they take on the number 23 Michigan Wolverines, looking to break a historically long losing streak tomorrow. We have a great guest on the show to break down this big game. Jon Blau of the Bloomington Herald-Times is the IU football and IU athletics beat reporter for the local paper in town. Joins us. Jon, how you doing today?
Doing good. How are you?
Doing well. Jon, a lot of history in this rivalry, and Tom Allen talked about it and said, I'm not worried about it. But I just mentioned it is a historically long losing streak. In fact, dating back to 1988 is the longest current losing streak actively of any college football rivalry series. How much does history play a role in tomorrow's game?
Yeah, like you said, Tom Allen said that, the past is not predictive, and that's one of those mottos they're trying to live by. I guess it's impossible to truly get into the heads of the Hoosiers and know what exactly is in there in terms of their psyche. But you have to hope, I guess, if you're a Hoosier fan, that obviously they proved it against Penn State. They can beat teams that they haven't beaten a lot in the past and pull one out. That's kind of an experience that helps build their confidence a little bit going into this. And like Tom Allen says, that the past is not predictive, and they can kind of live by that and expect that when they go into it.
Obviously, IU, it's surpassed expectations now, number 13 in the country, the highest ranking they've had since the 80s, 2-0. What's been your impression so far through the first two games for IU?
The defense has been the thing that's just stuck out to me a lot, because obviously the offense scored over 30 points 9 times last season. Pretty much most of the games they played, they were able to put up big points. They had Michael Penix Jr. coming back, Walt Phillier, Ty Freifogel, Peyton Hendershot, the running backs, Samson James, Stevie Scott. Everybody knew about that, was hopeful that unit would be pretty good. But then, when the defense is coming out and making plays and actually holding IU in that Penn State game and giving them a chance to win, that was pretty impressive and a huge deal, just because that defense in 2018, 2019, they played very young and they made mistakes a lot. And there were times where they were a little bit closer to a sieve than, something that was actually standing up against opposing offenses. To see the way they played at Penn State, keeping IU in the game, and then eventually they were able to pull it out. And then at Rutgers, to continue to force turnovers, 3 takeaways in each of the games. That's really stood out to me. And then, like you said at the beginning of the show, number 13 team in the country is kind of crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. But one part of that that's been one player specifically that's been getting a lot of attention is Michael Penix Jr., of course, the starting quarterback for the Hoosiers. The interesting thing is it's been a little bit of an inconsistent start to the season. Definitely struggled the first half against Penn State, obviously stepped it up on that last drive of regulation and overtime. And then it was kind of a strange game for him as well against Rutgers. Didn't look fully in a rhythm with his wide receivers in the first half. And then in the second half, they looked like a completely different team. What have been the issues that you've seen so far with this offense, and specifically with Penix getting off to slow starts?
Yeah, at Penn State, there were different qualities to the Penn State and the Rutgers game. The Penn State one, Penix looked rusty at the very beginning. There were throws that he just missed. And there were a couple times there were drops. I saw Walt Phillier drop one that was right in the hands. I know Peyton Hendershot later in that game, he was talking about that this week, just in terms of dropping a ball wide open on a 3rd and 4 that could have potentially just salted that game away. But yeah, Penix was a little off in that Penn State game. That's expected when a guy hasn't played since November of 2019 because of his sternoclavicular injury. That's a hard one to say.
Yes.
But yeah, and no 7-on-7s, and Tom Allen brought that up as well over the summer because of the COVID restrictions. And so there was going to be some, rust that had to be kind of worn off. It seemed like it really did, obviously in the very end of that Penn State game, but then going into Rutgers as well. It seemed like Penix was hitting them right in the hands. There were just balls that IU was just, the receivers were not, grasping. And I know Penix throws a fastball. That's a tough ball to catch sometimes, but obviously Peyton Hendershot said it after the game. said we got to catch those passes. We have to bring those in. If you count those drops, I mean, Penix probably throws for about 70% on the day. There's been some protection issues there too. I mean, the offensive tackles are probably getting beat a little more than you want. And obviously you have two new starters at guard that are still trying to get some protection things fixed. It seemed like that was a little bit better at Rutgers as well, but there's a multifaceted equation there, and I would say that Penix is definitely getting better. He's definitely getting better on his end.
You mentioned the defense before being no doubt the standout part for IU and one of the big reasons that they sit at number 13 in the country. And it really has been, as you said, just a shocking rise from being a liability the last couple of years, and even more so in the Kevin Wilson era, to really being the strength in this team. And it's all aspects of the field. They've have one of the best pass defenses in the Big Ten, but also the pressure from the defensive line. They have 5 sacks. I saw you put out a tweet earlier today, 5 sacks compared to, I think, just 2 sacks for the first 2 games against much worse competition, and 13 tackles for loss so far. I mean, what can you equate it to that when we've seen defenses in college football struggle so much this year with limited practice time, that IU has taken such a huge step forward on that side of the ball?
Yeah, and you call it a surprise, and I get that, but I think looking at the roster last year, just how young they played, but how athletic some of those players were, and the hope for their potential. I mean, when you look at Micah McFadden, who's a sophomore, Cam Jones, a sophomore at linebacker, you have Tywan Mullen, who's just a freshman who plays the way he does, and then you have the sophomores and Jalen Williams and Reese Taylor at corner. You have the juniors now, Devon Matthews and Jamar Johnson. They were all making plays at times. Just at times they just weren't in the right gap. They weren't. There was a coverage responsibility, I guess, in the back end that wasn't quite executed perfectly. There were times where they kind of showed their youth, I think the coaching staff always had faith that this is where it would get to. It was just hard to quite believe it definitely was going to get to this point. But then in the bowl game, even against Tennessee, they really came out and played some really good defense, and that gave you hope going into the offseason that they would step it up another level. You heard great things out of fall camp about Devon Matthews in particular. Obviously the linebackers, stepping up in terms of their leadership and their maturity. Cam Jones, Mike McFadden, both captains. And they've played smarter. And Kane Womack has talked about that just in terms of the athletic ability that they thought was there. Finally, it's being matched with some football IQ experience, and they're anticipating things, and they're getting to the ball faster, and they're swarming to the ball. And you're really seeing that just being very different this year through the first 2 games. And another key, and like I said, I haven't brought them up yet, is the defensive line, especially in the interior. There have been times in the past where IU defenses have just gotten really completely beaten in the trenches. You've got some defensive tackles, DeMarcus Elliott, Jerome Johnson, Sio Nofo-Onga Tatoa. All those guys are really holding their own. Obviously, Javon Swan, the grad transfer from Stanford. You got a rotation of guys now on the defensive line that are playing really physical and really well, that are really kind of helping anchor this defense and kind of really round it out.
That was an impressive pronunciation there on Sio Nofo, by the way. Really smooth. That one I've had to practice. Let's turn a little bit to the Michigan game. Obviously, the Wolverines coming off a very surprising loss last week to Michigan State. There's still obviously a lot of talent on the roster, number 23 in the country, Jim Harbaugh in his 6th year. What are you expecting from them as they come here this weekend into Bloomington?
Yeah, I mean, they're an interesting case just because obviously last year was not a close game with Michigan. I mean, it was close for a period of time. It was 14-all, and then they just ran up the points at the end. Shea Patterson absolutely destroyed the secondary. It was not a great day for the IU defense. But so it's a little different now. Obviously, Shea Patterson is gone, and Nico Collins, Donovan Peoples-Jones. A lot of those receivers that were really dangerous last year are not there. And again, kind of inconsistent results for Michigan from week to week. And I know that I forget if it was Nick Sheridan. I think Nick Sheridan was asked a question about what he thought about the Michigan defense and things like that. It's like, well, it's only 2 weeks, and obviously they won 1 game, and then they kind of had a stinker against Michigan State. So what exactly is Michigan? I don't know. I guess the main points, Tom Allen has said that he's really impressed with their running back group. He thinks they got a few, like 3 or 4 pretty good running backs who can run the ball pretty well. Obviously, they're going to have bodies up front. They're Michigan, so they're recruiting 3, 4, 5-star players. up on the front lines. That's always been a thing that's been hard for IU to handle, just the talent they have there in the trenches against some of those upper echelon Big Ten East teams. And then obviously Kwity Paye, the defensive lineman, he's an NFL caliber type of talent on that side of the ball. So that's going to be a test. I know Michael Dwumfor was an issue for IU last week. He was a Michigan transfer playing for Rutgers. You're going to see more Michael Dwumfors on the line for actual Michigan. And so how well does IU's offensive line handle that? That's going to be a big deal. And then Joe Milton, the quarterback for the Wolverines, 6'5", 243, but can run the ball. That's going to be an interesting combination to see how the IU defense corrals him.
One thing you mentioned was the depth, specifically with running backs. They have 4 backs that get carries, and also wide receivers. They've had 8 different players catch multiple passes this season, which is something at Michigan is typical, just the way they recruit. One thing, maybe the biggest concern from the IU defense has been they've gotten a little worn down late in games. Tom Allen has talked about finishing. They haven't been able to do that. Is that a big concern, you think, for IU, especially with the depth and the amount of players that Michigan can rotate in and out offensively?
As a concern, I would say if the offense doesn't stay on the field. I mean, that was the big deal in the Penn State game. After a while, it seemed like the offense was just asking too much of the defense. I mean, they were just out there for a long, long time. And if you get into another situation where Michigan is on the field, their offense against your defense for long stretches of time, if you're not establishing running game enough or being able to string together drives enough, whether it's the run opens up the pass or the pass opens up the run, depending on what they give you, then that's a concern. But I think if you are able to do enough offensively to maintain possession, I think that becomes less of a concern. It's really about those 2 units helping each other in terms of time on the field.
Now, to talk about the offense for IU, obviously you mentioned it's going to be very difficult against the defensive line. The secondary, though, has struggled this year so far for Michigan. Some big plays for Rocky Lombardi in Michigan State last week. Do you expect IU to try to take more shots downfield? We saw them try to do that against Penn State with limited success. Is that maybe something they try to attack tomorrow?
It would make all the sense in the world. I mean, obviously Nick Sheridan's not going to tell us that because he doesn't tell us exactly what he's going to do. But yeah, I mean, it seems like thus far with Nick Sheridan, I mean, usually it's somewhat conservative at times, especially early. Maybe he tries to come out a little more aggressive earlier than he has in the past. I know he's talked about that just in terms of wanting to be more aggressive, and he thought they were against Rutgers. But it's definitely an area I think you would try to attack. At the same time, though, I would think Michigan's defense, after they just got burned by Michigan State down the field, they're going to have tried to fix that part of their defense and make sure they come out a little bit better in that aspect. So it really depends. I mean, it depends what they give IU in the box. Are they going to really kind of sit back and try to just take the windows away from Michael Penix and try to take that away first, or are you going to see like more numbers in the box, which give you some of those one-on-one opportunities to go deep? It'll be interesting to see the way Michigan comes out, to see how they, what they try to take away first from IU, I guess.
It hasn't been a super quick start to the season for Stevie Scott or Samson James in terms of the running game. IU actually ranks last in rushing yards per game so far this season. How much a concern is that for IU going forward, including on Saturday against Michigan?
Yeah, it's a concern. I know Nick Sheridan was saying that, it's November. We're already only in our 3rd game, I guess, and that it's only going to get colder from here. And obviously it's not ideal to be, kind of run and shoot type of offense or something like that, where you're just only passing the ball when it's 10, 15, 20 degrees outside. So they need to get that figured out. Obviously, again, like I said, there's 2 new starters at the guard positions. It takes time sometimes for an offensive line to get completely in sync, to have 5 guys kind of working as one. Mike Kadick, you got obviously at that left guard position. He's been rotating with Dylan Powell, the Stanford grad transfer, and Mackenzie Wara on the right side, who played a ton last year when there were injuries to either Hunter Littlejohn or Simon Stepanek. But that's something that you have to be concerned about. But at the same time, you have to hope that over time, just them getting used to each other, that they can figure out kind of how to open up some of those seams a little bit better and how to, make their checks and make sure they're blocking the right guys and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And then, you hope that with the combinations that the coaching staff can figure out in terms of either opening it up with the pass first or in terms of just calling the right plays at the right time, that they can get more of those seams and get a more consistent running game.
At least for IU this weekend, won't have an issue with weather. As I mentioned at the open, absolutely beautiful in Bloomington, 70 plus degrees tomorrow. Should be a great game for a noon kick. IU, obviously the great win over Penn State, but you can make an argument they got lucky, obviously, with Devin Ford deciding to go into the end zone. Probably shouldn't have. IU really got a second chance. What from that game do you want to see one specific thing Indiana do better facing another top 25 team?
In terms of the Penn State game, if it's like a redo?
Yeah, essentially, what can IU do better over the course of the game, playing a team that's, I would say, probably at a similar level as the Nittany Lions in terms of talent-wise?
Right. Again, I think it goes back to what I said in terms of the offense staying on the field. I think in terms of being able to string drives together, being able to run the ball consistently when you need to get those yards. On a first down, let's say if they choose to run on 1st and 10, that they're getting 3 or 4 yards and staying on schedule, doing that a little bit better in terms of, keeping yourselves in 2nd and 3rd and manageable situations. And again, just not putting as much pressure on your defense, because I know this Michigan offense brings back a lot of different players, so we don't know exactly how exactly potent they are compared to what they were last year. But you don't want to give that offense that many chances to get ahead and make you catch up. You definitely don't want to put too much pressure on the defense again. I would say that's the number one thing. Obviously, the thing you want to keep the same is you want to get all the turnovers, takeaways, obviously. If they can do that, they'll be in a pretty good position to maybe get a lead and stay ahead like they did last time.
Yeah, IU 3 turnovers in both their first 2 games this season. Michigan, however, hasn't turned over the ball. So that will be an interesting thing to watch over the course of tomorrow afternoon. You look at the schedule for Indiana, obviously extremely challenging. Michigan State's looking a lot better. They got them in 2 weeks. Of course, Ohio State's coming up soon. That's always an extremely tough one against the Buckeyes. How important is this game when you look at Indiana's schedule for, where they finish in the Big Ten and kind of their season goals overall?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important in terms of, I think the one word for the week was elevate. To show that wasn't a fluke, like you said, with the Penn State game, where they got quote unquote lucky. To be able to beat both Penn State and Michigan in 2 of your first 3 games would be a heck of a statement. Obviously, we keep them in the top 25 poll, maybe even move up a little bit. And every week you can get in that top 25 poll. I know it really doesn't matter in terms of on the field, but in terms of the recognition, the prestige, what it does for you in terms of recruiting, as long as you can stay in that poll, is a big deal week to week. In terms of, practically speaking, is this like a game that if they lose, is everything out the window? No. I think winning that Penn State game gave you a lot of leeway, really, in terms of that was a game that not everybody expected you to win. And so you won it. And so now you have maybe a few mulligans in there. And following up with Michigan State, I think that's a game you hope you can win if you do drop this game. And so you're maybe 3-1 going into Ohio State. But if you do win this game, you have some momentum going back to Michigan State, a place where they had a heartbreaking loss last year. And you have a chance to improve to 4-0 before you play Ohio State, which would be a really big deal, because that may be a game of top 10 teams if they're able to keep that going.
And that could be a lot of fun in the shoe in a couple of weeks. It mentioned history with the first question. And I think one thing that's interesting is this is really their first big game against one of these big Goliaths of college football after that breakthrough win over Penn State and just the first top 25 win of the Tom Allen era. Do you think that might make a difference? A lot of people are looking at this as a close game late in the 4th quarter to how IU plays, maybe how Tom Allen, has play calls, and just the mentality of this whole program going into a big game.
Yeah, Tom Allen's talked about this a few times, just that, if we have the ball and we have Michael Penix at quarterback, and it's a close game, we know we can win it now. I mean, we've done that against Penn State. We've proven that. I guess the thing I'm mostly interested in is now how are IU's opponents going to view them? In the past, maybe this is a team and a program that other teams would look past, would say, like, we got to play Indiana, and you may get a trap game of sorts, and Indiana can kind of hang around a little bit longer. Michigan's coming off of a loss to Michigan State, which I'm sure they're sorely disappointed about. And now they're playing a top 13 team in Indiana, probably chomping at the bit to have a big quote unquote win. And you're playing, here in Memorial Stadium, an empty Memorial Stadium, because of the COVID restrictions. And it'll be interesting to see, now that IU is in this position where they are the quote unquote hunted, how do other programs come in and play them? I mean, you got to be on top of your game, or there's a chance of something bad happening where you don't look very good against one of these, big dogs, because they're not looking past you anymore.
Couple more questions for you, John. We're 2 games into the season. Obviously, we've learned a fair amount about the team, but a lot of questions. We've talked about some of the big names already: Penix, Scott, Devon Matthews on the defense. Who's a player that we're not talking about that you think has had a big impact and could really be important on this team going forward the rest of the year?
I guess who I didn't bring up in particular, Reese Taylor, I think has been particularly good this year. Tom Allen said he thought that he had his best game at Rutgers. Obviously a former quarterback in high school, Mr. Football. I mean, he was dynamic as a quarterback at Ben Davis, one of the better high school football players we've seen in this area in a really, really long time. But obviously he was slowed in terms of his transition to corner because his freshman year, there were a ton of injuries in the quarterback room, and they had to throw Reese Taylor back into quarterback during his freshman year as kind of an emergency guy, and then finally gets a chance to really settle into that corner position as a sophomore. But he has a couple of injuries. One of them is a hand injury, which makes it so he can't return punts, which was going to be one of the more interesting roles he was going to have. He's dynamic with the ball in his hands. We saw that in high school. So he had a nice return in the Penn State game. He hasn't dropped any yet. There were a couple of tough punts at that Rutgers game, actually, and he didn't muff them. He handled the ball pretty well. So he'll be an impact player, you would think, in the special teams phase, but also just defensively. He made some plays in the run game last week at Rutgers where he got off, I don't know if he got off a block, I forget, but there was one where he recognized the Rutgers run play, and he was, almost beat to the outside. He just recovered and just swarmed the guy for a tackle for loss. And it seems to be doing well in coverage too. The touchdown last week, Taiwan Mullen gave that up. And obviously, Tom Allen talked about that being a very rare thing because Taiwan Mullen doesn't make mistakes like that. But Reese Taylor's held up in coverage. And if you have 3 corners with Reese Taylor, Jalen Williams, and Taiwan Mullen who can all cover, then you're going to have a pretty good defense, especially on the back end with the secondary.
One thing you mentioned, Reese Taylor's contributions on special teams, and I think that's been one part of IU's game that's been really impressive so far. Obviously, Charles Campbell's been really good, got a Big Ten Special Teams Player of the Week at Rutgers last week. Indiana really struggled, I think, at times in special teams last year, most notably in the Gator Bowl, probably cost them that game against Tennessee. Was that kind of a motivating factor maybe for Indiana in the offseason to really focus on it going into this year?
Yeah, I mean, Tom Allen talked about having more of his own focus on special teams. I think he knew that Gator Bowl play was a pretty big deal and something that they had to, fix the way they were playing on special teams. It still dogs them to this day. I mean, they have had some good special teams play in terms of Charles Campbell. Obviously, haven't had any terrible mistakes in terms of a bad long snap or anything like that. But there are 2 plays thus far, one in each game, that Tom Allen has later said on his radio show that he wanted to throw up because of. There was the Jarrett Smolar power squib that didn't actually turn out to be a squib that ended up almost looking like an onside kick. That gave Penn State a chance to kick a field goal at the end of regulation. That one was not great. I mean, they have to limit those types of mistakes. That one wasn't great. And Rutgers, obviously, the hands team was out there on the field, but a lot of shifting, a lot of motioning by Rutgers, and they weren't quite it seemed like that they didn't know which person should jump on the ball. I think Tom Allen said Brian Fitzgerald may have had an opportunity, but he didn't really go for it and went through a bunch of hands. They need to do better in terms of fixing those, because one of those could really hurt you down the road. But yeah, in terms of overall, the special teams, like you said, Charles Campbell's been great with his kicks. There haven't been any bad snaps. Hayden Whitehead is a really dependable punter. Those things are there for you, and those can win you games. And the Penn State game obviously was won by 1 point. So you have a couple field goals from Charles Campbell that were a significant distance. For him to make those were huge. And so, yeah, you feel good about your kickers, and you feel good about your long snapper, Sean Ratcher. Just got to clean up some of those things in the return game and I guess the kick game in terms of that squib.
Couple more questions for you, John. Indiana 2-0 now, coming into playing Michigan, and I honestly just blanked on my question. I'll get back to that one and whatever I was going to say in a minute. I know you mentioned time of possession as being really important tomorrow. What's one other key that you're thinking for Indiana might be the difference maker in a game that's supposed to be really close?
Yeah, I think I brought it up maybe before, but I'll say it again. The turnover/takeaway game, I think, is really important. Michigan has not turned the ball over once yet this season. They're not a team that's been loose with it. And considering how huge the takeaways have been for IU in each of their 2 wins, if they can't get the ball out of Michigan, it's going to make things harder in terms of having to definitely sustain offense and win field position and do all those things right. So you want to keep the takeaways coming, but they're somehow going to have to get Joe Milton into a bad situation to get him to throw a pick, or they're going to have to strip the ball loose on one of these guys. So I think that's going to be huge. I mean, does IU take care of the ball like they have been for the most part? A couple turnovers, but not a ton this year. Been able to take care of the ball for the most part, and are they able to strip it away from Michigan? I think that's going to be probably the deciding factor potentially in how the game goes.
I remembered my question. I wanted to ask you one more question about Joe Milton, who can use his legs, be a dual threat quarterback. And we've seen Indiana struggle with that so far. Sean Clifford had a career high in terms of rushing yards with Penn State, went over 100 yards. And Noah Vedral had some success with his legs as well, the quarterback for Rutgers. Why has that been so much of an issue for IU so far? And could Milton maybe take advantage of that tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, IU has been known to play a lot of man coverage. I think they're trying to mix it up more and kind of keep themselves in situations where they can spy the quarterback and have a person responsible. So, I mean, obviously, if you're a man and they just run everybody deep and there's nobody left there to cover, it's not a good situation for you. But I would say there were improvements from week 1 to week 2. Sean Clifford, obviously, like you said, got those 100-plus yards on the ground. There were times where they actually held him in and they were able to force some turnovers from it, but there are other times where they didn't, especially late with that 35-yard touchdown. But again, in week 2 against Vedral, I mean, at the end of the day, he finishes with like 16 rushing yards. It's not terrible. I know he had a couple of runs, but they were able to get some pressure. They will be able to be pretty disciplined in their rush and able to, especially with their coverage on the back end, allow the rush to get there and to kind of mess up a couple throws. I mean, Sio Nofa Onga Tatoa, I'll say it again. And
you're just showing off now.
Yeah. Well, it's because Sio tried to explain to me how to pronounce his name my first year on the beat, and he didn't explain it very well. He said he just spelled it out, the Aga part, and I actually had it wrong. I thought it was Aga Tatoa, and later it was Onga, and so I've really practiced it. But yeah, Sio had that one where he kind of pushed the lineman back, was able to get a hand on Vedral, and then there was the other one with Cam Jones on the blitz. And as long as they're holding up pretty well and being disciplined in their rush, I mean, holding up well in the back end in terms of secondary, and then also being disciplined on their rush with the defensive line, which they did well against Vedral, I think they can be pretty good. But the thing about Milton is he's huge. He's almost as big as like Ben Roethlisberger. So in terms of getting that guy on the ground after you're disciplined with your rush, that adds another element. That'll be interesting to see how IU handles that.
All right, John, we've broken down both sides of the ball. Really good analysis here. What's your prediction for tomorrow, and why does that team win?
I went on a Michigan podcast and I predicted Michigan winning. So since I guess this is an IU podcast, I guess the IU wins on this one. I don't know, like 28-24. Let's say that. Why not?
So close, low-scoring game, maybe coming down in the last couple of possessions, you're saying?
Yeah, it could be 42-38 too. I don't know. You never know. But yeah, I'll say we'll go with 28-24.
Should be a fun game. A lot of history on the line. IU fans, they certainly don't like Michigan. So many close calls over the last couple of years, and obviously dating back all the way to 1988, the last time Indiana beat Michigan. Jon, great insight. Good luck at the game tomorrow, and thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that will do it today for our episode of Unpaid Interns. We will be back on Monday breaking down this big Indiana-Michigan game. But for now, go ahead to our YouTube page. You can check out all of our Unpaid Interns episodes there, or you want to listen to them in audio form, you can always go on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts to check out all of our Unpaid Interns episodes there. For Jon Blau, I'm Griffin Epstein. Enjoy Indiana and Michigan this weekend, and we'll talk to you again on Monday.